Well, listen, we are so glad that you're joining us here today for week one of our brand new series called The Way Back. And let me just start by asking you a question real quick. Have you ever had the experience where you are flipping through your phone, you're scrolling through your phone, you're looking at your mobile device, you're looking at pictures, and all of a sudden you come across a picture of maybe a certain friend, people that you were close to in a season of your life, and as you look at that picture, you sit there and you think, what in the world ever happened to them? Like, we were so close at one point in our life. We haven't talked in years. We haven't done anything in years. There was no big blow up. There wasn't a bunch of hurt and pain. There wasn't an event that led to it. In fact, you look back on it and you don't even know when or how it happened. You just realize now, as you look at those old photos, you're just not as close as you used to be. And if someone were to ask you about it, you would say something to the effect of like, I don't know, we just drifted apart. You would use language like that, or you might say, I don't know, we just lost connection. But you know why this happens. I know why this happens for my life when I look at pictures and see people that I'm just not as close to anymore. And it's because there's a really simple principle at play that's true of all relationships, and it's this. The fastest way to drift apart in a relationship is to stop paying attention to it. That's always the fastest way. The fastest way to drift apart in a relationship is to stop paying attention to it. We've all felt that moment. We've all had that moment where we've drifted away from the people and the things that used to be most meaningful to us. But here's a real question. Here's the real question. What do you do when you feel like you've drifted from God? What do you do? What are you supposed to do when it feels like you've lost connection with God? Maybe you look back into a season of your life and it felt like you were alive. Like you look back at a season in your relationship with God and it felt like you were just alive in new ways. Your faith was full of confidence. You could sense that God was near. You could sense Him working in your life. You were praying and you were seeing God move things as a result of your prayers, and you were connecting dots all over the place that you had never connected before. And something in you, it was like your heart was just alive to a new reality. And then you don't know when it happened. You don't know how it happened, but somewhere along the line, you just lost connection. And it's not any one thing you can point to. You just sort of drifted away. You just stopped paying attention to it. Life came your way. You had a kid. Work picked up. Life got busy. Distractions set in. And guys, let's just be honest for a second. This last 18 months, really, it has been full of distractions and circumstances that have absolutely just clamored for our attention and our energy. And as a result, a lot of us have just grown a little bit disconnected this last year. In fact, I came across these words recently of someone who was trying to describe what they have felt over the last year. This is what they said. They said, over this last year, with everything that's kind of come their way, they said, I have found myself completely and entirely absorbed by all that was going wrong around me. With the world in lockdown, I gave myself permission to opt out of the things that mattered most. I pulled back from worship. I withdrew from caring for friends who needed me. I neglected to encourage those around me. I complained more and I prayed less. That's what disconnection from God feels like. And for any of us who can somewhat relate, it's like we look back into a past season of our relationship with God, almost like an old photo, and we think, man, what happened? I've drifted a little bit. If that's you, I have some really good news for you. There is a way back to connection with God. In fact, when you look at the scriptures and when you hear the stories of men and women whose faith has sustained them, even through seasons of disconnection with God, there are a few themes that start to emerge as habits and practices in their lives that kept them connected to God no matter what circumstances they face. And that's what we want to talk about in this series. That's what we're going to talk about over the next few weeks. Specifically, we're going to talk about 5 habits. Five habits that followers of Jesus have embraced since the very earliest days of the church that help to reconnect us to God, to help us to find our way back to God, or to keep us from disconnecting in the first place. And so today, for week one, I just want to start by talking about the very first habit that helps us find our way back to God, and it's this one right here. It's the habit of participation. The habit of participation. And in particular, when we talk about participation today, I'm talking about participation in the life of a church. It's the habit of participation in the life of the church. Because if you were to sit down with someone who you would say has a faith that is not shaken easily, We all have those people in our life, people who we look up to for their faith, who feel like they're always connected. If you were to sit them down and you were to, they just always seem to have a connection with God that consistently holds up, and you were to ask them how they do it, one of the things that they would tell you is that they've just made a habit. They've made a habit somewhere along the way of active participation in the life of the church. Now, I'll explain a lot more what this means here in just a minute. But let me first just say that there is a burden underneath this that can actually be framed in a negative way. And it's something that as leaders and pastors here at the church, I'm just telling you, we have seen this too many times to count. And it's this: people tend to drift away from a community of faith before they drift away from faith. Doesn't happen all the time, but by and large, someone drifts away from faith, you can almost track it back to that it started with drifting away from community of faith. You've seen it. You've seen this in other people's lives. You've felt it as well. There's just something that roots you, that nurtures a connection with God when you are actively participating in the life of a faith community, specifically a church. And this has been a practice and habit of followers of Jesus since the very earliest days. In fact, I love the description of how the followers of Jesus were living this out in the first century, and I want to take a look at it with you. And so if you have a Bible, turn to Acts chapter 2. If you don't have one and you're in one of our rooms, there's some around you. Page number's on the screen there. Acts chapter 2. If you need to go on your mobile device, find it, whatever you need to do. But I want to look at this passage with you. Because this passage describes this habit and what they experienced as a result of this habit and how they begin to find their way back to God and how they kept a deep connection with God and the role that participation in the life of the church played in that. So look at Acts chapter 2, look at verse 42. It says this: all the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. Now let's just stop there for a second. I love that word devoted. They devoted themselves to something. I love that word devoted because it carries with it a sense of urgency. It's like these first followers of Jesus, they discovered quickly that if they wanted a faith that would weather the storms of life, if they wanted a connection with God that would remain strong, they would need to devote themselves to some habits that would put them in positions to stay connected. And Luke uses a really interesting word to describe one of the habits that they devoted themselves to. It's this. Remember what he said? He said all the believers devoted themselves to, is right in the middle of it, to fellowship. Now, I realize that the word fellowship, that is a really weird, churchy kind of word that no one uses in normal life. It's not like you're going up to your coworkers and be like, do you guys want to fellowship over lunch? If you do, you're the weird Christian guy or something if you do that, right? No one talks like that. But the reason why the translation is a little bit awkward is because it's kind of hard to capture the full idea of that original Greek word. The New Testament was originally written in Greek, and the Greek word that's translated fellowship is the word koinonia. And it's a really rich word in the Greek. It carries with it the idea of active participation in another one's life. It carries with it the idea of sharing life with someone and having them share life with you. It has everything to do with participating in the life of someone else. This is so important to understand because what this means is that the habit that kept them connected to God, it was not just showing up to an event for an hour a week called church. That's not what it's talking about. What they devoted themselves to was an active participation in the life of the church. A couple months ago, I guess back in June, a couple friends and I, we loaded up the car. We headed to Philadelphia for Game 5 of the Sixers-Wizards series. And if you've never been to a Sixers playoff game, I'm just going to tell you now, don't take your kids. They may hear some things they cannot unhear. I'm just saying. And they're gonna hear 18,000 people saying those things that they cannot unhear. The night that we went was actually the first time that the Wells Fargo Center was opened up to full capacity. So it was in rare form, which that is saying something for Philadelphia fans. I think the best way to describe it, to kind of bring you in on that night, was just to show you a real small clip of a video that I took of the guy who was sitting right in front of us. So this is the guy who was sitting in front of us, and that's a guy who knows what it means to participate. He didn't come to spectate. He came to participate. And guys, I'm not joking. He did that for 2.5 hours. And as I was leaving that night, there was this thought that struck me. It was this: as I was sitting in traffic, about to take the trip back home, I just thought to myself, why in the world did I just spend a bunch of my money to go to that game when I could have just watched it for free on TV? And why am I now gonna get home at 1 a.m. when I could have just turned it off at 10:30 and been asleep? And why did everyone around me pay no mind to cranked up Sixers fans sitting in front of us, blocking our view? But I know why. You know why. Because I didn't go just to watch the game and spectate. I went to participate. If the point was just watching, if the point was just spectating, I could have just done that from home. But if the point was to participate in the experience, to contribute my voice without the expletives, then I could only do that there. And I think part of what Luke is describing here is that there is something deeply personal that happens when we gather corporately. Because look what Luke says next. He says, a deep sense of awe came over them. And the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders. And all the believers met what? Together in one place and shared everything they had. They sold their property, possessions. They shared the money with those in need. They worshiped what? Together at the temple each day. They met in homes for the Lord's Supper. They shared their meals with great joy and generosity, all the while praising God, enjoying the goodwill of all people. And each day the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. Now, obviously, Luke wants to stress here. The writer of the book of Acts, his name is Luke, and Luke wants to stress that there's something unique. There is something, in Luke's words, awe-inspiring that happens when we gather together. He uses that word twice. It's like he's trying to make a point. You felt this, and you've experienced this. In fact, one of the things we heard a lot over this last year was, I just missed church. You know, during COVID, when we had to shut down for a little bit, I just missed church. I just missed church. I just missed church. We heard that all the time. You emailed it to us. You called us. You let us know. You called us on the street and said, I just missed church. Now, when people said they missed church, they were not talking about coming to a building. If that were the case, we could have just said, oh, that's fine. Tuesday afternoons at 3 o'clock, we open the building. You can walk through it and you went to church. That's not what they're talking about. And when people said, I just missed church, they're not talking about the preaching, because you can just get that online. You can download that on a podcast. That's not what they're talking about. They meant something way more by that. They meant the gathering together aspect of church. In other words, there is a personal connection to God that is deepened and strengthened when we gather corporately. Because here's what happens. When we gather together, we are reminded of who God is. That happens every time we gather together. We're reminded of who God is, His grandness, His power, His strength, the fact that we can trust Him with all things. And guys, you know this as well as I do. We live in a world where we need to be reminded every now and then that God is still in charge. God is still in control. No matter what circumstances around us may tell us, we need to sing songs. We need to pray prayers that remind us of who God is and His power and His strength and His trustworthiness. But not only when we gather together are we reminded of who God is, we're also reminded of who we are. That we are loved beyond measure. That we were created in the image of God with worth and value. That we are sons and daughters of our Heavenly Father. And that Jesus Christ speaks the final word over us, and His final word is love. So we're reminded of who God is. We're reminded of who we are. But when we gather together, we're also reminded that God is up to something in this world that is bigger than you, and it's bigger than me, but at the same time includes you, and includes me. And when we isolate ourselves from the community of faith, we quickly lose that perspective. If I were to get a truck and I were to say, I want you to come see my new truck. I want a new truck so bad. I'm just telling you right now. I'm not getting one, but I want a truck. And so it's going to work its way into lots of stories and illustrations for me. But if I were to get a truck and I were to say, man, you got to come see, I want you to see my new truck. And you came over to my house and I opened up the garage and you walked in and you saw a steering wheel sitting by itself over in the corner. and you saw 4 tires stacked up over against this side of the wall, and you saw a radiator over there, and the drive shaft over here, and the engine block is over there, and you saw all the electrical components laid out in the garage, and I'm sitting there looking all proud, you like my truck? You would say, Jason, you don't have a truck. You have parts. It only becomes a truck. It only has the power to move when it's what? Assembled, brought together, put together. Now, the first Christians, they didn't have cars, they didn't have trucks, but they did have another way of talking about this idea. Because one of the very first leaders in the church, his name was Paul, and he writes this letter to some of the followers of Jesus living in the city of Corinth, and this is what he says. He says, all of you together, there's our word, assembled. All of you together are Christ's body, and each of you is a part of it. In other words, there is a unique contribution you, right now, that you have to make to this body that can only be experienced when we are together. There is a depth to the Christian faith that I cannot experience when I am isolated from the body. Now, here's why this is so important, so important. So just lean in for a second. You see, what Paul is articulating here, it is a complete reframing of what church is. If church is just an event on a weekend or on a Monday night that we get an inspirational message, we sing some songs, I really don't need to show up for that. In other words, it's not necessary to be together for that. I can just download it and I can just listen to it later. I can just find the songs on Spotify. Another way of saying it is this: if the point of church is just to get something out of it, there's really not a need to be together for it. But this is a remarkable idea that Paul and the first Christians are articulating here. Participating in church isn't just to get something out of it. Paul is saying that you will know that you are maturing in your faith when you begin to ask, what did I bring to church today? Not what did I get out of church today? That is a marker of a mature faith. In fact, he takes this idea even further in a letter that he writes to the first followers of Jesus living in the city of Ephesus. This is what he said there in Ephesians. He says, instead, be filled with the Spirit. Here's what's crazy. Listen to what he says next. Speak to one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And it's this to one another part that's fascinating to me. Because we might expect him to say to sing to God, like isn't that who worship is for? And yet Paul makes it so much more relational. Which means that there are some weekends that we gather together and you sing for you. Because you need to be reminded of who God is and who you are. And you pray that weekend for you. Because you're in a season of your life, you just need prayer. And you come down front, and every weekend we have people willing to pray down at the left corner of all of our rooms, and you stay on the chat, to be prayed for, and you need prayer. In other words, some weekends you show up, it's for you. You need to be encouraged. You need to be strengthened. You need hope. You need a little bit of faith, your faith sort of emboldened. But then there are other weekends that you devote to participating. But you're doing good. You're fine. You're in a great spot. And on those weekends, the reason you come, it's not to sing for you. You come that weekend to sing for someone else, to be their voice who can't sing that day, who might be sitting right around you. You remind them of who they are. You pray for them. You engage them. You welcome them. You greet them. You show up for them. Because there's just something that reignites hope, something that expands our faith, and something that reconnects us to God when we devote ourselves to the habit of showing up and participating in the life of the church. Not just for what we get out of it, but for what we bring to it for someone else. Now, let me just tell you a tension I have felt this last week leading up to this weekend. I've felt this many times. These thoughts have gone through my head a lot. And the tension is this. We live in a really different world now than obviously 2,000 years ago. There was no internet, there was no podcast, there was no church online. Being together face to face to be the church and participate, that was the only option they had. And over the last 18 months with the pandemic in particular, we've had the opportunity to keep our church here connected through our online platforms. And the tension that I have felt leading up to today is just this. I realize that for some of you, you cannot make it out physically to church. I know how vacations work, done it, been there, done that. I know how sickness works, got it. I have kids, right? I understand that. I know how travel schedules work. I realize that some of you don't live anywhere close to one of our 18 LCBC locations. I understand all that. So in other words, there's legitimate reasons why you literally can't show up to this church at times. And I also realized, the other tension I felt is there's a lot of news out there right now about the Delta variant, and it's caused some of you to be a little bit more cautious about returning. I respect all that. So let me just say this. When you cannot make it to church for the togetherness of it all, for whatever reason, I hope so badly that you stay connected through our online platforms. That's what it's there for. But I also know something else. I just know that where online is excellent in delivering content, it is limited in delivering opportunities to participate. And maybe you're different from me, but I can tell you this, I've never once sang out loud in my living room while I'm watching church online. And my family's really grateful for that. So again, let me just restate it again so you hear me loud and clear. When you cannot make it, please leverage the God-given technology of the day to stay engaged through our online platforms. But my guess is this. My guess is that there are a lot of us, we're actually in a different camp. It's not that we can't make it. We can make it. We can make it out. We've just got used to not making it out. I was having lunch this week with a friend who told me straight up, they're like, the only thing keeping them from coming to church and participating in the life of this church instead of just watching online, it's just the habit now. It's a lot more fun to do it in your pajamas in bed on a Sunday morning. Actually, a few weeks ago, I was out with my family and a woman came up and introduced herself to me and said that they are planning on coming back this fall, which I think is great. But it did strike me as a little bit odd that some people feel comfortable being out in public settings like where we were that was surrounded by people in that moment, feel very comfortable being out in public settings, but just haven't made it back to church yet. And my guess is that the reason we're comfortable with going out to other places but not church, it just comes down to habit. We've just broken the habit. And all I'm saying today, this is all I'm saying. All I'm saying today is that it may be time to reset some habits related to church in order to reconnect with God. Because as good as online has been to keep us all engaged with the content, the experience of participation is not the same. And the point of being the church was never just to deliver content. It's always been to show up for one another, to participate and contribute to each other's lives. And yes, that is a habit that those first followers of Jesus apparently had to devote themselves to. Because just like our day, there were a lot of other things competing for their attention. But as a result of them devoting themselves to this habit, they were filled with awe and wonder at what they saw God doing when they were together. And outsiders took notice. Remember, it says they had the favor of all people. Why did the outsiders take notice of this? Why were they curious? Why were they intrigued? It wasn't the event of church. It wasn't just the content. It was the way in which they watched these people participate in each other's lives, showing up for one another, worshiping God together, sharing their lives, serving each other, and loving up close and personal, and that changed people. A few days ago, Kyle Major, he's our campus pastor at our Clark Summit location, and he forwarded along an email that he had received this week from a woman named Danielle. And our Clark Summit location, actually, it's one of 3 campuses of Parker Hill Church that recently joined LCBC. And so as I read Danielle's story, it was so much fun just reading how she kind of went back in her story to talk about the impact and the role that Parker Hill Church has played in her life. As a 17-year-old, Danielle, she ran away to New York City to escape an abusive household. A few years later, she makes her way back to Pennsylvania and really just to find herself in another abusive relationship at this point, but this time having the responsibility of a baby to care for in the middle of it. And she talked about how one night she reached the end of herself. As she held her crying baby, I think she said it was 3 a.m, this baby is in her arms crying, and she was overwhelmed with this sense in that moment, she said, a feeling like the choices that she had made in her life and the experiences and the circumstances that she had faced in her life, it disqualified her from being a mom. She didn't deserve this. There was someone better for her little child than her. And she contemplated what it would be like to die and how everyone around her would be better off without her here. But she had heard about Parker Hill Church from others around town. However, the father of her child told her she was not allowed to go there. Never go there. Not allowed to go there. But she was at the end of her rope. And she was reaching for God. And this is what she said about the first time that she showed up to church. She said, I figured out a way to sneak out one Sunday and go to Parker Hill. I'll never forget pulling into the lot and seeing people walk in. I felt so awkward. I felt alone and different from everyone. They were perfect Christians. I was broken. They would see right through me. I knew it. I almost didn't get out of my car, but I felt God nudging me. So I got out. And I slowly walked across the lot with my baby in his carrier, and it was my very first time attending church. And then someone smiled at me and said hi. I could breathe a little better now. I walked through the glass doors scared to death, but someone guided me into the auditorium. I chose to sit in the back row in the dark so no one would notice me. I will never forget the feeling that came over me and the release that I felt come out of my soul. I felt like I was home. I had never heard music like that, and the people were actually singing. I sat there and I cried and I cried. Not a bad cry, a release cry. I was so happy. And a woman came up behind me while I was sitting and crying, while everyone else was standing and singing, and she just gently put her hand on my shoulder. For the rest of the time, she never said a word. I knew it was okay now. I knew I was okay. And Danielle goes on in her email to describe how since then she has grown in her faith in such immense ways, and how she's now invited others in her life to experience the same thing, and how some of them have given their lives over now to following Jesus as a result. And one of the things that struck me as I read that email this week is how grateful I am for the people who showed up that day for Danielle. And they didn't know they were showing up for Danielle that day. They didn't even know her name. They didn't know her story. They didn't know that a wave and a hello would awaken her heart. They didn't know that walking her to the auditorium would be something she would remember for the rest of her life. They didn't know that a hand on the shoulder would speak life into her brokenness. And all of that happened because they made a decision that day. They decided to show up. They devoted themselves to something, to participate, to contribute. What can I bring to church today? Who am I here for? Who can I sing for today that can't sing on their own right now? Who can I walk beside? Who can I reach out to and embrace and demonstrate compassion? And it changed a life. It redirected an eternity. And I think I know why. Because Jesus told us why this happened. He actually promised something that explains why this happened. Because Jesus said, "For where two or more gather together as my followers, I am there among them." Guys, I'm not going to try to pretend to know everything that mysterious statement means. But I know what it means at the very least. At the very least, it means that when a group of people gather together in Jesus' name, he shows up in a unique way. He does something different than when we are isolated, living apart as our own separate parts in a garage somewhere. So if you're trying to find your way back to God, looking to reconnect with God, or desire to stay connected to God, this habit of participation in the church, it is one of the catalysts for that to happen. The habit of showing up and participating in the life of the church, because people tend to drift from a community of faith before they drift from faith. And the first followers of Jesus, they knew this. And so they did something absolutely remarkable. They devoted themselves to the habit of showing up and participating. And as they did, they encountered Jesus. Because he promised they would. And he promises you will as well. So here's how we're going to end our time together today. I'm going to ask all of you to stand, no matter where you are right now. Just go ahead and stand at all of our rooms, all of our locations. I'm going to ask you to stand. And we're going to sing. I'm going to ask you not to sing like some of you normally sing, which is the band sings and you watch. I'm going to ask you to participate. It's a demonstration. This is the habit we want to create, right? To find our way back to God. I'm going to ask you to participate, not just spectate. And to help with that, our bands are coming out in our locations right now, and we're not asking, though, the full bands to come out. It's a kind of a stripped-down version of the bands. Just an instrument or two and your voice. So I'm going to ask you to sing loud for those here today who need you to sing for them. And if you're here today and you're wrestling and you're struggling today, then I just want you to sing loud as well, but more as a prayer, as an act of faith of saying, God, I don't even know if I believe all this, but I want to believe it. Then sing it. And if you're here today and you can't sing because you don't believe or you've lost hope, you're struggling, then please let this church sing for you right now. So let's sing together.
He changes everything in one moment. His Spirit breathes life into the room. Come now, fill us too. I've seen Him set others free. Now I need it done in me. Speak change to my life. What's wrong, come make it right. An encounter with Jesus is all we need. An encounter with Jesus is all we need. It's all that we need. Oh, it's all that we need. Oh, so I will look to Him. He is able. I know He is able to make things right. Speak God into my life. An encounter with Jesus is all we need. An encounter with Jesus is all we need. It's all that we need. Oh, it's all that we need. Oh, so speak life, speak encounter with Jesus is all we need. It's all that we need. Oh, it's all that we need. Oh, an encounter with Jesus is all we need. Yeah. An encounter with Jesus, it's all we need. It's all that we need. Oh, it's all that we need. Oh, it's all that we need. Oh, it's all that I need.
Connection with God, encounter with Jesus, it starts with this habit of showing up and participating in the life of the church. Because he promised that when we gather in his name, something remarkable happens. He shows up. So I'm just going to ask you, how are you doing with this one? How are you doing with this habit? Maybe it's time to devote yourself to something you've never really devoted yourself to participating in the life of the church by showing up with the intention of asking what you can bring for others. And as you do, you'll start to reconnect with God because you'll be reminded of who he is, who you are, and your participation and your willingness to show up. It might just be the thing that unlocks faith in someone else's life. Listen, today, if you'd like to pray with anyone or talk with anyone about anything, we would just love to have our opportunity to pray with you today. If you're at one of our LCBC locations, there's people down the front left corner of each of our rooms, and when we're finished here, come on down. They would love to have the opportunity to pray with you. If you're online, the chat will remain open for the next few minutes, and just stick around. Let us know how we can be praying for you there as well. So LCBC, may the Lord bless and protect you, and may the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see you next week for week 2 of The Way Back. See ya.